So in order to reuse this dashboard item component as a wrapper for these specific dashboard item components, we must make it more reusable. Specifically, we must make sure that the image source, the image alt, and this title here can be set from outside this dashboard item component, so to say, so that we can use this dashboard item component as a custom element in different places and then configure the concrete values of the image, of the alt text, and of the title depending on where we use it. And you did learn how you can make a component reusable and configurable. You can add those inputs. And therefore here in this dashboard item component, I want to accept two inputs. One for the image, which should give me the data for the image file and the alt text, and one for the h2 tag. And you learned that there are two ways of registering inputs in Angular. You can either use this input decorator or the input function. And I'll again show you both here so that you really are aware of both, because depending on the Angular version you're working with and the project you're working on, you might be using different approaches. So you must know both. So to register an input, an attribute of this custom component, so to say, you can use the add_input decorator followed by the name of the input you want to accept. And that name is up to you, and it could, for example, be image for that image data. Then you should define the type of data you expect to get here. And I expect to get an object here. So that's now not an object value I'm creating, but since we're on the right side of the colon, this now actually is an object type I'm defining. So I'm defining the shape of the object I expect to get as a value on that image property. And I expect to get a property value here, which is an object which should have an src property, though this of course is up to you, which should be of type string, and an alt property which should also be of type string. So I expect to get such an object as a value for image. In addition, this dashboard item component really only works if I do get image data, and therefore image should actually be a required input. And you also learned how you can tell Angular that it should be required. You can pass an object to this input decorator and set required to true. And this will now tell Angular to throw an error if that value should ever be omitted. Now, since it is required, we know that we will get a value here, and we can therefore add an exclamation mark here to tell TypeScript that this will never be undefined, which it otherwise doesn't know. Now, that's not the only input I want. Instead, I also want to get my title input, and this should also be required here in this application. So I'll set required to true here as well and add that exclamation mark. And here I expect to get a simple string as a value. Now, alternatively, instead of using add_input, you could also use that input function. In that case, I would still want a property that's called image, an input that's called image, but we'll turn this into an input by assigning an initial value instead of using a decorator. And that initial value is the result of calling the input function, which must be imported from @Angular core. Though this input function is only available if you're using Angular 17.1 or later. Now, when using this input function, you can still mark image as a required input by adding a dot after the function name and calling required. So by using this function that's defined on this function, so to say. And this then tells Angular that this should be a required input. And of course, you can and should also still tell Angular which type of value will be received as an input here. And here you do that by using these angle brackets after input before the parentheses, or after required in this case before the parentheses. And you then put your type definition between those angle brackets. This is a so-called generic type here, or you're setting a generic type value to be precise, which here simply means that you give TypeScript extra information about which type of value the input will eventually receive. Well, and then we can also add the title input here by using input required, and here I expect to get a string. With that, we're getting those inputs on the dashboard item component. And in the dashboard item component HTML file, we can now use these input values. For example, here on that image source, I now want to set this source property value I'm getting on the image input. And we can do that by, first of all, setting up property binding here. So by binding the source property of image to a dynamic value, to the result of a TypeScript expression. Because now it no longer will be some hard-coded string, but instead a value that's dynamically extracted from that image property, so from that image input. Now, since here I'm using the input function, image will actually be a signal, an input signal, which it wouldn't be if we would use @input. In that case, it would be a regular property. But since it's a signal here, we actually have to execute image like a function here to read that signal's value. And then I can access .src here to get the source property value. If we would be using the @input decorator, we would instead access it like this, without executing it like a function. But here, this function execution is required. And the same is true for the alt text. We should also bind this dynamically by wrapping it with square brackets. And then call image.alt like this, also executing image since it of course is a signal. Well, and for the title, we now should execute title here, but of course, this would now output this as a hard-coded text. To instead dynamically resolve that value and execute this code, you must wrap it between double curly braces. That's Angular's string interpolation syntax, which evaluates this expression and outputs the result of this expression as text in the template. So that's how we output the title. Well, and with that, we're almost done. We can now already use that dashboard item, and then in a next step, make sure that the actual component content will also be part of that component here again. But first, let's use it like this. And for that, I'll go to my app component HTML file. And there we can and should now replace these divs with the class dashboard item with our custom component, since we have that div with that class inside of that dashboard item component now. So in the app component HTML file, we can and should now use app-dashboard-item here, also for the closing tag, and do that for all those divs. Like this. Of course, we now also must set those properties though, those inputs, the image and title input. So on all those components, we should set image to a value and set title to a value. And let's start with image. The value to which I want to set image should be an object, because I am expecting to get an object as an input type here, an object with that shape. And therefore, in order to do that, we must set up property binding here by wrapping this with square brackets, so that between those double quotes, we can now have some dynamically evaluated TypeScript expression. Which in our case here means that I simply want to set up an object here. But I want this to be evaluated as an object and not as plain text. That's why we need property binding here. And then here I want to set the src property and set that to a string, and the alt property and set that to a string. And now here the value for the src property for this server status component should be status.png, and the alt text can be a signal symbol or something like that. Now for the title, it's different though. Here, I just want to pass in a string as a value, and therefore we actually don't need property binding here. Because whenever you set up property binding by wrapping a property, an attribute, you could say, of a component with square brackets, you're telling Angular that the code between the double quotes should be evaluated as TypeScript code. So if I now would pass in my title like a signal symbol, Angular would actually look for a variable called a and try to set the value of that variable for title. Or actually it would fail since this here is invalid TypeScript syntax. If I were to go into a TypeScript file and I would write that code, I would get an error because this is not valid TypeScript or JavaScript syntax. But that is what will be evaluated if you're wrapping a property between square brackets. So therefore, if we need a string here, we could wrap that between single quotes so that this is indeed again evaluated as a string. But of course, this is a bit redundant because now I'm wrapping this in single quotes between those double quotes because I'm setting up property binding here. A simpler way for passing a string to a property is to omit those single quotes and to not use property binding like this. Instead, now by using this code, I'm still setting the title input on this component, but I'm not setting it to some dynamically evaluated TypeScript expression result, but instead just to a plain string. So therefore, whenever you have an input on a component that should be set to a string value, you don't need property binding, you can just set it like this. But with that, we can now grab that code and also use it on all the other app dashboard items. And here for the traffic, I want to set an image of globe.png and a text of a globe. And then the title should be traffic. And here, by the way, the title, of course, should not be a signal symbol, but server status. That was a mistake, but now it's correct also down here. And we can now copy that to app dashboard item. And there I want to use the list PNG file and have an alt text of a list of items and set the title to support tickets. And with that, we're using that app dashboard item component in multiple places, and we're therefore reusing that component, but with different configurations. Now, if I save that, I'd get an error though that app dashboard item is not a known element, because of course I didn't register it with the app component yet. So that's something we need to do. In the app component TypeScript file, we should now also add the dashboard item component to the imports array and add that import statement at the top of the file here. But with that, if you save that, if you reload, you see these boxes are showing up again, and we see those images and those titles, so that configuration through the inputs seems to work. But of course, the actual component content is missing, and that's what we'll fix next.